Hi, Jody Hardesty with Empowered Heart Connections. So many of us struggle to find a common ground when it comes to many topics in relationships, but particularly right now, the topic of politics is coming to the forefront, especially in America, we are having a looming election. And what I have found in many relationships is that the division, the polarization of these two opposing sides has created so much hostility and frustration for so many people. And it is difficult for people to see what the reality of the situation is versus what they've been promoted to fear or be concerned about. And I found that in many topics of division in relationships, it often comes back to fear and division and an inability for people to see the commonalities that they have, as opposed to really reiterating and emphasizing the differences. And I encourage people to think about what is it about their belief, whether it's politics, whether it's religion, whether it's your perspective about equality, about family, about parenting. What is it about those perspectives that sometimes keep us rigidly holding to I'm right and you're wrong, rather than being able to come to a middle ground with what perhaps do we have in common? And is my motivation that is particularly fear-driven, is it true? Is it accurate? And how do I know that it's true? And if I know that it's true, what information do I have to verify that? Well, how do I absolutely know for certain that that is 100% true, that my truth, my perspective is all right and anyone else's perspective is all wrong? This, like I said, in many relationship topics can come up. For example, religion is a topic that people can feel this way about. It's either all or nothing. And some of these topics can be deal breakers for relationships, especially if it's like, hey, I'm a particular religion and I want to raise my children in that religion. And if you don't agree with that, then I don't want to have a partnership with you. So some of these things may be deal breakers, but I often find that a lot of times people can come to a middle ground if they're willing to be flexible. I have seen couples who are together happily and have different beliefs in religion. And as long as they agree typically on how they raise the children, usually it works out relatively well. It's whenever you have two diametrically opposed opinions on either we raise the kids religiously or we don't, those are really difficult to come to a middle ground. But if one parent doesn't necessarily want to be involved in the religious aspect of parenting and the other one does, and they're both okay with that, this can actually work out relatively well. Again, it's about finding that compromise, that ability to understand and agree with what you do have alignments on, which for many, many topics, there are plenty of things that people can align on. But it's when we focus on the differences or the division that it makes it really, really difficult to be able to come together. And I've seen many of these topics also tear apart families and divide families. And it breaks my heart to know that there are such topics that are important but are insignificant in comparison to the importance of family relationship and emotional connections. And I think it's possible. I've seen it actually be possible in many relationships where people can come together. But it takes, first of all, being willing and able to listen and hear each other and honor each other's perspective, even if you disagree. And this is where it can be really challenging. And I've found for me that it's really helpful to honor each other's perspective first before maybe your partner can hear and validate your own perspective. So to really make sure you're acknowledging, I understand that that's, the way you see that makes sense. I can see how that, and from your perspective is totally clear. And from my perspective, this is kind of what my belief system is, and this is kind of where I come from, and this is the information that I have that feels like that's supporting that belief system. But there are very few beliefs that are black or white. There's very few beliefs that are all or nothing, that actually there is only one right answer and only one wrong answer. So to be really open-minded, especially when it comes to people you love and adore and have a relationship with and have connections with, that is it really worth it to you to cut off those relationships or to not grow a relationship because of your black and white perspective on what your version of right or wrong is. Because we all have a different vision, a different perspective about what that looks like. And like I said, it's super important for people to be able to work on what they have in common instead of focusing on their differences. Because there's far more commonalities than there are differences for, I find, the majority of people, especially in relationships. And usually there's something they can find a connection or a common ground on. So some other topics that can cause conflict in relationships are where people go on vacations. This sounds minor in comparison to some of these other topics, but this can be a real issue of conflict in relationships, is whether or not one person wants to go one place, or one person wants to travel less time, or one person's maybe more concerned about finances and the other person is more concerned about having an adventure. That these differences can be really difficult to find a middle ground on. But again, it is possible. So how can you come together? How can you say, okay, you want adventure and I'm frugal. How do we find that middle ground? Is there something that we can compromise on? Can we maybe have a shorter vacation? Or can we maybe figure out a way to save up for the vacation so we're not using credit cards? How can we find a connection rather than just fighting over the differences? Because that's what I find people, especially right now, are feeling really unable to hear, honor, validate, and be willing to go, okay, you may have a point. You might have a difference of opinion than I do, but I can understand from your perspective what that looks like or what that feels like, even though I disagree. So again, you don't have to agree necessarily to understand each other. Like, okay, I understand you're very worried about, us spending too much money, and you're really more concerned about saving money, and I get that and I agree with that. However, I also would like to have some adventure and live life a little bit. So how do we meet in the middle? Again, there are ways to do that. And those are discussions to have. Does it feel better to the more frugal person to save up for that vacation? Does it feel better to have a shorter vacation? Does it feel better to have maybe a staycation? How do you do that? How do you make that feel like it's more of an adventure? But to remember that, again, it's about our connection with human beings. And when we connect with human beings, we can actually solve problems. We can get things done. We can resolve conflicts. But it's when we get in our separate corners and it's I'm right and you're wrong, there's really no room for movement. And this is what concerns me about our political divide and all of those opposing opinions in our world is how do we come to the middle? How do we not acknowledge that there's differences, but also acknowledge that there's similarities and that there's ways that we can connect emotionally, that we can connect and maybe even solve problems and maybe even shockingly learn from each other, right? This is something that I have found remarkable in many relationships that I've observed and worked with, is that when people are willing to open themselves up to hearing other information, they grow. they're able to go, oh, maybe you have a point about that. Or maybe you're completely wrong about that and I have a point about that you don't know about, but I can hear and validate you. But often when people are willing to open themselves up to questioning their own version of I'm absolute right and you're absolute wrong, that we can grow and we can expand our thinking, and it helps us to see things from both sides. And this is one of the joys I have about being a coach and a therapist, is working with people from different sides of the spectrum, that no matter where they are. And my job is to help them come to peace with wherever they are at. And that means I can't say that my way is right and your way is wrong. I have to go along with what their belief system is, as long as it's not harming them. And this is one of the tools that has been really eye-opening for me, is to see like, okay, I get this, that most of these people, their base needs are the same. They want to be heard, they want to be honored, they want to be valued, they want to be respected. And the politics, the religion, or parenting styles are usually just kind of surface issues that are really a kind of a distraction from what they're really looking for, which is to be heard, to be validated, to be understood. And again, you can do that even when you have differences. Parenting styles is another one of these tricks that is really tricky to navigate, especially if one parent's maybe more of a disciplinarian and the other one kind of lets them get away with everything. Is finding a middle ground with that can be really challenging, because usually these differing opinions are triggered a lot by our own emotional experience. So maybe if we were, as a kid, a little more neglected by our parent, then we might overcompensate by kind of spoiling our child, and maybe our partner was maybe spoiled, and so they kind of overcompensate by disciplining too much. So finding a middle ground, this is where it's like, I think it's so profound that a lot of times opposites attract to each other. And part of that is because they can really learn and grow from each other. So if you're willing and able to go, okay, how much of this is about my emotional triggers, and how much of this is about me being right or wrong, and how much about this is about me being willing and able to open my mind to someone else's perspective and maybe shift a little bit. Like, all of us could benefit from a little shifting. It's most beneficial whenever we're able to grow and change and learn, rather than just dig our heels in and lock ourselves into our own perspective and find what is called confirmation bias, find information that validates and supports our belief system, rather than looking for maybe some information that might disprove our own rigid beliefs. That it's important to explore both sides of many of these topics to make sure that you are getting a well-rounded perspective. And that's really hard to do right now, because it is pretty easy to be completely polarized in whatever direction you're going. But to recognize that there are very different versions of how we perceive reality. And if we are able and willing to be able to, again, come together and acknowledge, validate, hear, and support each other, we can put love and connection first instead of division. And I know that's really difficult right now, but it's so important to be able to see the humanity in your opponents and the humanity in people who have opposing opinions, because when it comes down to it, we're all vulnerable, tender people. Most of us are trying to do our best and make connections in the world in a positive way. So I hope this has been helpful. Again, remembering that we all have differences. We can either promote our division or we can promote our connection. And the more we promote our connection, the more movement and power we have to make this world a better place. And maybe that's optimistic, but I believe it's true. I've seen it happen in relationships, and I've seen relationships and people really grow and thrive when they're willing to do this. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this has been helpful. Please click the like and subscribe button if you have found this helpful. Thank you so much.